Hello and welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. My name is Megan Wynn, and I'm the Community Events Manager at the Peninsula Open Space Trust, and I'll be your host for tonight. You're watching Fungi Fundamentals Part 2, Top 10 Mushrooms of the Bay Area, hosted by Post, featuring special guest, mushroom scientist Christian Schwarz. Happy New Year, everyone! It's the start of a new year and the beginning of mushroom season. With the recent rains and the unique ecosystem of the Bay Area's coastal redwoods, conditions are perfect for mushrooms to thrive. Whether you're just sprouting interest in mushrooms or you're already foraging for knowledge, our speaker tonight will guide us through the science and stories behind these remarkable organisms. Be sure to stay till the very end because we're going to share about a special opportunity to go on a guided mushroom walk with Post and the president of the Santa Cruz Fungus Federation. Tonight's 90-minute presentation will be interactive, and we encourage your participation. To ask questions in the live chat, you'll need to log into YouTube. We will address your questions at the end. And for the best viewing experience, you can watch directly on YouTube or click the full screen button at the bottom of the right corner of the player if you're watching on the Post website. The recording will also be available on YouTube after the event ends. Please follow the community chat guidelines so that we can create a positive and inclusive environment tonight. That means please be kind, no harmful speech, foster constructive discussions in the chat, no spam or self-promo, and we reserve the right to remove any comments. For those of you who are new to Post's work, we are a nonprofit land trust, and our mission is to protect open spaces on the peninsula and South Bay for the benefit of all. We are creating a network of protected lands where people and nature connect and thrive. And since 1977, Post has protected over 89,000 acres of land. Here's a short 30-second video on what we do.
Since our founding in 1977, Post and our partners have preserved the peninsula and South Bay's sweeping landscapes.
These are the places we know and love.
Places that wildlife call home.
Places we rely on for food, fresh air, clean water, and our health.
We're just getting started. Post protects nature because nature sustains us. Nature connects us all.
You can learn more about Post on our website at openspacetrust.org. We host many free events every month, as well as share free resources like our hiking guides if you're looking for recommendations on where to go in the South Bay and the Peninsula. Before we dive into the program, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement and invite you to share what native land you are currently occupying and tuning in from today. The land in Post working area includes the territories of the Amamutsin, Muwekma Ohlone, Ramaytush Ohlone, Tamiya Nation, as well as other Native organizations and individuals who are descended from the first people of this land. These lands have been home to many Native tribes since time immemorial and whose people are still here with us today. I want to acknowledge the land itself, including the Santa Cruz and Diablo Mountains, the San Francisco Bay, and the Pacific Ocean, as well as all the watersheds and ecosystems that make up this landscape we call our home. And thank you for sharing in the chat. I see folks calling in from the East Bay, Sebastopol, San Jose. Thanks for being here with us tonight. I hope this moment can serve as a reminder that as residents of these places, we have a responsibility to be caretakers of our shared home and neighbors, including wildlife. All right, folks, if you're new here, I have a surprise, fun, interactive activity for us tonight. It's time to play the Fungi Fundamentals Pop Quiz. All right, folks, it's time to play the pop quiz. Here's how this is going to work and how you can participate. You'll need to log in and scan this code with your phone, or you can play along in the YouTube chat or out loud, or if you're watching the recording, the link won't be live, but you can still play along with us. You can also go to menti.com. The link is at the very top, and use the code 5431-3083. The code is right there, 5431-3083, or scan this QR code right here. All right, I'm going to give folks a moment to join And again, you don't need to log in if you don't want to play with the, on your screen. You can just play out loud or use the chat. So for the sake of time, we're going to keep going, but you can join in the middle of the quiz. There's about 5 questions. So here we go. Join at any time. And I see a lot of you already in there. So we are going to start soon. Here we go. You can join at any time. All right. Question number 1. Can you be poisoned by touching a toxic mushroom? Yes or no? Go ahead and lock those answers in. Don't look at that screen if you want to, pick first, but don't be swayed by where everybody else is going. Make sure you pick your best guess. Can you be poisoned by touching a toxic mushroom? All right, a few more seconds before I switch to the next screen. Here we go. If you just joined us, go to menti.com and use the code 5431-3083. But the next slide will have the QR code so you can scan. Here we go. The answer is no. All poisons are dose dependent, and you will never absorb enough mushroom toxins to cause poisoning simply by touching them. Some species of mushrooms can cause rashes in allergic people, but this is fairly rare. And I recommend if you ever touch anything and you're not sure, definitely make sure you wash your hands as well. But good job. Most of y'all got that correct. Let's keep it going. Again, scan that QR code if you just joined us. And I see a lot of you answering the chat. So good job, everybody. Here we go. Question number 2. Are all mushroom decomposers? Yes or no? Lock in those answers. I see a lot of y'all already saying yes or no. Let's see how it is. Okay, where everybody's evenly split. Let's see where we are thinking, folks. Yes or no? 50-50 chance here to guess. Mushrooms are decomposers. Yes or no? Okay, I'm going to give it a few more seconds, and then we're going to jump to the next slide. Here we go. Ready? The answer is no. Although many mushrooms break down dead organic matter, some are actively harmful to live plants, animals, or other fungi, and others still are mutualistic partners of trees and shrubs. As you'll learn tonight, the world of fungi is so big and so vast, and we're going to learn about so many different species and stuff, so not all of them are decomposers. All right, here we go. Next question. Is it true that mushrooms are toxic? Yes or no? Here we go. What do you think? Yes or no? Are mushrooms toxic? Bonus points if you can identify the mushroom on the screen. It's a very popular culinary one. Let's see if you can guess it. Yes or no? Are mushrooms toxic? Again, if you just joined us, go to menti.com, use that code if you're watching the recording. Thanks for watching. We're going to show the answer very soon. Oh, look at you guys. Got the bonus question. Good job. It is a chanterelle mushroom, but very good, very good. Okay, here we go. A few more seconds, and we're going to give you the answer. Is it true that mushrooms are toxic? The answer is no. Very few mushrooms are seriously toxic to people, and relatively few are considered good edibles either. Most mushrooms are too rare, too small, too tough, or simply bland or unpleasant tasting to be considered for food. This makes it easy for beginners. Spend your first year learning 5 dangerous and 5 delicious species in your area. This quiz was brought to you by Christian Schwarz. So he created this quiz that we're giving to you today. So lots more information to come. Okay, I think we have a few more questions. Here we go. Next question. Are the same kinds of mushrooms found in forests across North America? Yes or no? Lock in those answers. 50-50 chance. Here we go. What do we think, folks? Yes or no? I'm loving the chat energy on the YouTube chat. Again, if you want to join us in the live chat, you'll have to log into YouTube. You can watch directly on our YouTube channel, or if you're watching it on the Post website, the chat box is at the very bottom of that page, so you can join there as well. Okay, a few more seconds. Yes or no? Are the same kinds of mushrooms found in forests across North America? Here we go. Let's find out the answer. The answer is no. All right, you guys are crushing this quiz so far. Different mushrooms have different lifestyles, and many are very specific to certain trees or shrubs. Even within California, you will have to learn how to recognize habitats if you have your heart set on finding a particular mushroom. So many different mushrooms. They're found everywhere, different habitats, different species. So get out there and explore. All right, I believe this might be the last question. Here we go. Are mushrooms difficult to learn to identify? Yes, no, or it's kind of complicated. I don't know. We're gonna figure this out. Are mushrooms difficult to learn? I mean, there's so many. I get it. It's probably pretty difficult. You probably will take a long time to figure it out. But yeah, this one's a little bit of an easy one. It's kind of complicated. Here we go. The answer is complicated. There are a lot of them. There's a great deal of them, and we have yet to learn about how to recognize them. But in many ways, they are easier than birds. They don't fly away. They don't have special equipment you don't need any special equipment, and there's a large enthusiastic community out there who's eager to teach and learn, and it's a great introduction for the ideas of ecology and evolution more broadly. Okay, I lied. There's one more question, and we want to know, what are you most curious about today? Let us know. This will help us guide our Q&A session, and I just want to curious, take stock of who's out there, what you guys are interested in. You can only pick one answer, so what are you most curious about today? And I want to know. Let's see. Obviously, we already know this. Foraging is going to be top 1. Identification, number 2. And the science, number 3. Culinary is pulling at number 4. Medicinal next, and then other. Okay, for those of you who said other, can you put in the chat what you mean by other? Because I'm very curious. Those 5 people, what do you mean by other? I'm very curious what you think. Also, yes, all of the above. I see you in the chat. That is also really real if you picked all of the above. Okay. Foraging and identification. I see common species to forage, science. Okay, cool. You guys are ranking them in the chat. Very good. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for playing. I hope you guys enjoyed this little pop quiz to get us primed. I'm going to get off the games show stage here and get back into the mushroom forest land. Here we go. And let's get this show started. I know a lot of you are interested in foraging. I know. Trust me. Me too. And I just want to let you know that over 4,000 people registered for this event. And 1,000 more are going to watch the recording. And let's just say, if all of us were to go out and find mushrooms and go off trail, that can be really damaging to the environment. And, we've seen social media blow up places. That's not what we want to do here. I just want to remind us that conservation begins with all of us. And if we can practice mindfulness and respect nature and follow these simple rules, we can make a really big difference. So I just want to emphasize that number 1, we want to recreate responsibly. Remember that foraging is prohibited in local spaces because it disrupts the ecosystem's balance. Always review the rules and regulations for public lands before taking anything with you. And remember that private lands always require permissions from landowners. And number 2, please stay on trail, because going off trail can damage the soil, harm native plants, spread invasive species, and cause erosion. So please stay on designated paths so we can help preserve the natural environment for all. And so by protecting and preserving nature and following these simple rules, we can ensure that these spaces remain beautiful and protected for wildlife and for future generations to enjoy. So make sure you're only leaving footprints, no trash, and only take with you pictures and memories. All right. With that being said, I've kept you long enough with waiting. Let me introduce you to our speaker tonight. Christian Schwarz studied ecology and evolution at UC Santa Cruz, where his interest in the world of fungi began. He is co-author of Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast and now spends his time seeking photographing, collecting, teaching about, and publishing research on macrofungi of California and Arizona. He is the collections lead for the California Fungal Diversity Survey and is research associate of the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. He is passionate about biodiversity in general, and especially in the philosophy and practice of community science. Let's bring Christian to the stage. Hey, Christian, how's it going?
Hi, Megan. How's it going?
Welcome back. We're so excited you're here with part 1, and now we're here for part 2. Can you give us a refresher on why you decided to become a mushroom scientist?
I don't think I really decided to. I think it happened to me. The mushrooms got a hold of me, and I have not been let go. So I guess I'm stuck with mushrooms for the foreseeable future. But I got into them by accident. I didn't really know about mushrooms or think much about mushrooms. But my brother convinced me to go on a hike to look for mushrooms with him in San Diego one year when it was super rainy, and there were different species everywhere, and they were all different colors and all different shapes and sizes, and I was sort of instantly hooked just by the diversity of form and the beauty of them. And now I'm here 20 years later.
Well, we're so excited to hear about your knowledge, and definitely can relate to one person just bringing you and giving you the opportunity, and that just like snowballing into something even more. So we're so excited to have you here. Can you tell us a memorable mushroom moment you've had?
Yeah, this year I traveled a lot, and one of the places that I traveled was to southern Mexico. And I saw a mushroom there that I really wanted to see. I'd been wanting to see for a long time. And it's called the blue jack-o'-lantern. So some of you might know about the jack-o'-lantern that we have here in California. It's a bioluminescent mushroom. It glows in the dark. And ours is orange. And almost all of the jack-o'-lantern species in the world are orange. But the one in southern Mexico is like deep blue, totally different. And I sort of stumbled into it totally by accident, and it blew my mind. So that was a real high point for me this year.
Wow, that's so cool. Any hypothesis on what's causing the difference in color?
None whatsoever.
Well, one can hope and dream that we'll find these mushroom mysteries, right? So, all right, last question, and then we'll jump in. Can you tell us about what you'll talk about today?
Yeah, I'm going to give you a little brief introduction about what fungi are, the basic life cycle of a mushroom, a little bit about the ecology of mushrooms, a few slides about basics of identification, which is a whole discipline that you'll spend 5 years getting familiar with if you really want to get into this. But I want to give you the first outlines of it tonight. And then I really want to just profile the top 10 plus a few bonus mushrooms that are here in the Bay Area and in Central California generally that you need to know about if you're interested in foraging for your own wild edible foods.
Awesome. Well, we can't wait. All right. So, reminder to our live audience again, you'll need to log into YouTube to participate in the chat and ask your questions. We'll try to get to the questions that some of y'all submitted in the registration process, and then we'll ask them all in the Q&A session after. All right, Christian, let's get your slides up. It's enough for me. Take it away.
All righty. Everything look good on the screen? Okay. All right. So thanks for joining me tonight. It's always a pleasure to be here with the Peninsula Open Space Trust. Thank you to Megan and the whole team behind the scenes for making this happen. Let's launch right into it. So some of you may know me as an author of Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast. That was a book that I published with Noah Siegel back in 2016. But just this fall, our second book came out, Mushrooms of Cascadia, which deals with the bioregion just north of the Redwood Coast. So rather than the California coast, it deals with the Cascade Mountains as well as the coastal areas of Oregon, Washington, British Columbia. So if you want it, it's now out, available from Backcountry Press. Another thing I want to say is that the Santa Cruz Fungus Fair is this weekend. I assume I'll be seeing a lot of you there. I hope so. If you come by, you can pick up these books from me, and my co-author Noah will also be there. We'll be signing them. So come visit. Alrighty, so there are three basic ways that people encounter the world of wild mushrooms in the United States. And those three basic ways are either through being warned by your parents that all mushrooms are dangerous and you should never touch any of them because they might poison you. That's what I was told as a kid. There are those people who are lucky enough that their parents foraged for wild fungi with them and taught them how to recognize something like morels or chanterelles or oyster mushrooms. That was not my experience. I hope some of you got to experience that. And then psychedelic fungi are another route through which Americans become aware that there are fungi, wild fungi, beyond the button mushrooms that you get in the grocery store. Psychedelic fungi are having a renaissance, obviously, as they're being investigated for their therapeutic properties, treating various kinds of diseases and disorders that cause human suffering. So those are sort of three main routes that people are familiar with to getting to understand that there is a diversity of fungi beyond what we're familiar with on our pizzas. But those aren't really the ways that I personally typically engage with the world of wild mushrooms. I, in my research and in my teaching, am mostly interested in all of the other mushrooms that don't have any sort of interaction with humans most of the time. We don't know much about their names or what they do out in the environment. But tonight I am going to be focusing on the culinary aspects of wild fungi, on how to go out in the woods and look for wild species that are edible that you can find. You can learn to be familiar enough with them that you recognize them and are comfortable eating them. But we'll get there only after a little bit of introductory background. So I do want you to focus your attention on this cycle, and it is a cycle that shows the basic life history of a mushroom from its origins inside a spore all the way to the shape that we call a mushroom, and which I'll probably call a fruit body for most of the rest of the night. So if you hear me say fruit body and it sounds unfamiliar, all that means is the mushroom itself. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through this. We're going to start at the upper left of this diagram. You can imagine two tiny spores floating in the air. Spores of mushrooms are basically microscopic in virtually all cases. You can't see them, but they're floating in the air all around you, especially if you're standing in a forest. And two spores that are floating in the air might land as they settle out of the air on a wet leaf. And if they're lucky enough to land in a place that's suitable, they will germinate. And those spores, once they germinate, have this sort of branching network of fibers that have a chance of meeting each other. And if those two spores meet each other through this branching network of fibers, they can fuse and they can exchange genetic information. Then they exchange their DNA. And that forms a big carpet of fibers, a big branching network that we call the mycelium. And if you learn one word tonight, I want you to learn the word mycelium, because the mycelium is the true body of the organism, the fungus that we pick the mushroom of. The mushroom is just the fruit. That's why we call it the fruit body. It is just the reproductive structure. So this mycelium grows and it gathers water and it eats nutrients from the soil or the wood that it's growing in. And eventually, if the conditions are right, it inflates a little balloon of tissue into the structure that we call a mushroom. And the mushroom only has two purposes. That's to allow sexual reproduction between those two parent spores. So the DNA gets all mixed up and combined in new ways. And then that DNA is pushed out into the world in the form of more microscopic spores. So spores to mycelium to fruit body, those are the three main phases of the mushroom life cycle. And what we interact with is just the part of the life cycle that lasts for a week or two, or maybe a month at the longest. So mushrooms are what we can see, but they're not the main part of the life form. The organism has a whole nother part of its life cycle that's out of sight because it's buried in the ground or buried in wood. This is really important for a few reasons. It helps you understand why mushrooms grow where they grow. It helps you understand why they're seasonal. It helps you understand why picking mushrooms is not terribly harmful from the perspective of conservation. And it also explains why taking care of litter layers and mycelium and soil health is extremely important from the perspective of conservation. If you want to keep mushroom populations healthy and protect the ecosystem, you don't need to worry so much about picking mushrooms. You do need to worry about the damage that you do to the soil. So if you're trampling, if a bunch of people are visiting the same areas over and over, that's how mushroom mycelium actually gets damaged over time. I'm just going to answer one or two of these questions because there's some good questions. There are not male and female mushroom spores, but there are mating types. So two spores from the same fungus are unlikely to be able to mate because they're often the same mating type. But some mushrooms have up to 23,000 different mating types. So that would be like male, female, and 29,998 others. It's a complicated situation. There are some mushrooms that have two mating types, just like people. Sex does happen in the gills. That's a really good question. That is where the sexual recombination happens, not when the mycelium touch. Okay, I'm going to skip to the next slide. Great questions that you're all asking, but mushroom life cycles are complicated and we don't have time to answer all of them right now. So we're going to focus on that last little bit of the cycle, the fruit body, the mushroom itself, because that's the big part that is in our world that comes up above ground and that we can see and we can pick and we can examine and look for different characteristics to identify. So we're going to focus on the structure, and in particular, we're going to try and find the fertile surface of a mushroom. The fertile surface is usually easy to figure out because it is the surface of the mushroom that's most finely divided. it's either spongy pores or radiating blades of tissue called gills. That's what you see at the upper right there. Or teeth that hang down like icicles from the underside of the cap. Or it's even branching arms that look sort of like coral. These are not the only forms that a fertile surface can take, but these are 4 examples of some of the main ways that you'll see mushroom fertile surface arranged as you go out in the woods and pick different mushrooms and examine them. And one of the reasons that it's important to be able to figure out what surface is producing the spores, that's what fertile means, is that there's something called a spore print. And this is one of the most important basic skills to learn as a total beginner mushroomer. You need to know how to make a spore print. And the way you do that is to find the fertile surface on your mushroom and detach the stem, if there is a stem, and place that fertile surface face down on a piece of glass or paper or foil, and you just leave it there. And after a little while, maybe 6 hours or overnight, you can lift up that mushroom gently. If it's got a cap, you lift the cap, and you should see something that looks more or less like this. If it's got gills, you're going to see an accumulation of spores that make a fine layer of powder corresponding to the position of each one of those gills. So that mushroom has been sending out spores overnight, one by one, until they accumulate into a fine layer of powder. You don't care so much about the pattern that they make. You care about the color. What we're looking for when we make a spore print is the color of this fine layer of powder. It can be white, it can be beige, it can be cream, it can be ochre, it can be brown, it can be chocolate brown, it can be black, it can be purple, blue. A whole range of colors are possible, but those colors will be your first clue as to what group your mushroom might be in. If you use our books, hard to see that. There is a section right at the beginning of the book that divides all of the content of the book, all the different species, by their spore color. So it'll be the first thing you need to know as a total beginner. Eventually, as you become more intermediate, advanced level, you will not use spore print color at all. You will figure out how to identify mushrooms without having to make a spore print, which is good because having to set up a spore print all the time is a little tedious. It takes 6 hours. It takes a while. So it slows you down at first, but it's really important to learn to do and to do it often. When I was a beginner, I was doing spore prints every day. I would set up 5 or 10 mushrooms in my garage all winter long. I would have mushroom spore printing in there until I got familiar with what was likely to come from what mushroom. Once you've got your spore print in hand, you can move on to some of what I call the other identification basics. And these are the ones that I ask people to really key in on. Now, the first 2 aren't really features of the mushroom inherently. They're features of where you encountered it and when you encountered it. So the date and location can actually be really important clues, and you'll see why later on in the talk. So keeping note of where you were, at least generally, and what date, that can be important. But as far as looking at the mushroom itself, structure is super important. You'll notice that I list color lower down in the priority than structures because beginners tend to get a little hung up on the particularities of color when in fact fertile surface texture or structure and the textures of the mushroom are actually much more important. They're much more stable and reliable features. So I'll show you a mushroom anatomy diagram in a few slides here, but structures, textures, then colors. Substrate is really important. What the mushroom is growing on, that's actually extremely important. I'll show you an example of how important that can be in a second. And then generally speaking, how big is your mushroom? Now, I don't ever really ask people to measure their mushrooms. This is not like botany, where a difference of a few millimeters can make all the difference from a species identification, because mushrooms are basically water balloons. They stretch and inflate and fill with water from the soil, so they can be small in dry conditions and large in wet conditions. So they're actually quite variable in size, and it's more important to get a general sense of how big the species you're looking at is without having to measure it necessarily. Stephen asked an important question regarding spore prints. Is the underside of the mushroom the same color as the spore print? And the answer is not always. In fact, it can mislead you. So a spore print is really important to do if you're a beginner because you might be led astray by the color of the underside. It might make you think that it's got brown spores, but actually they're white. So it's important to verify by taking a spore print. Good question, Stephen. Okay, so here's that mushroom anatomy diagram. And you'll notice these are only two kinds of mushrooms. Guild mushrooms on the left and boletes on the right. I'll talk more about what those are later. And you don't need to memorize this diagram right now. It's available printed in the beginning of both of our books. You can also find mushroom anatomy diagrams everywhere online. You can Google a bunch of different versions. They're really easy to find. But knowing these basic terms will help you speed up your understanding of the descriptions that you find in books so that you don't have to stop every 5 seconds and flip to the glossary in the back and remind yourself what that term means. There's really 5 or 10, maybe a dozen terms that you really need to internalize so that you can read the descriptions more fluently and navigate your way through identification guides. So we're going to go back to the fertile surface now because there are some subtleties about this that help you divide mushrooms into different groups. On the upper left, you see a mushroom that's got kind of a spongy pore layer. That is what we call a bolete. Bolete is a growth form. It is not an evolutionarily closely related group of mushrooms necessarily. It's like saying bush or tree. It's just a shape. Same goes for guild mushrooms that you see at the upper right, radiating blades like the spokes of a bicycle wheel away from the central stem. Below that, you have a toothed mushroom, mushrooms with teeth. And then on the left, you have a coral mushroom. And these are all just groupings of convenience. They don't necessarily reflect close evolutionary relationships, but they do help you figure out which part of the book you should flip to look for a species name. There's also a subtlety about guild mushrooms. If you have a guild mushroom on your hands, you want to look at how those gills are attached to the stem. The stem is sometimes fused to the gills, like in this case, attached gills. Sometimes the gills run way down in an arch. So they're actually deeply attached and swooping down to the top of the stem. Sometimes they have a curve or a notch to them. That's a little more subtle, harder to see. And sometimes they're totally free. This is actually really easy to see. So if you twist the stem of a mushroom like this, you can pop it out without disturbing a single gill. Something I want you to pay attention to on this mushroom is that there's a collar, a flaring ring on the stem below those gills. That's what we call a partial veil. I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds about what a partial veil is because we don't have too much time tonight. But if you go back a few slides or watch this video later, you can look at the mushroom morphology diagram and see where the partial veil is, how it's different from a universal veil. There's good videos on YouTube explaining this. So there's a lot of resources for catching up on these anatomy terms. Okay. Substrate. So what a mushroom is growing on can sometimes be the easiest way to tell two similar species apart. So if you were to come to me at the mushroom fair tomorrow and say, I found a green-capped mushroom, pretty small, the size of a dime, with a yellow stem growing in redwood forest that was kind of slimy, I would say it's one of two species, and I don't know which one because you didn't tell me what it's growing on. And if you told me, oh, it was growing directly on oak wood, I would tell you it's the mushroom on the left, a deer mushroom, a pluteus. And if you told me it was growing directly out of the soil in a redwood forest, I would say, oh, it's a parrot mushroom, a hygrospy, not closely related at all. Now, another easy way to tell these two apart would be to take a spore print. The one on the left has pink spores, the one on the right has white spores. So without having to set up a spore print and wait for 6 hours, you could just pay attention to what the mushroom was growing directly out of. So substrate can be really useful. Another set of ID details that can be really helpful is bruising or staining or color changes. So if you look at the underside of a mushroom and then scrape it with your fingernail and see if it changes color, that can be an absolute slam dunk identification characteristic, at least in combination with other features. Also, odor and taste. But the reason that I call these supporting details rather than essential is that odor is really difficult for beginners to describe. You have to take some time to learn how to describe the aromas that you're encountering. And taste, I don't always mention as essential because not everyone is comfortable tasting mushrooms right at the beginning of their journey into mushroom identification. Likewise, habitat and tree association. Once you become a more intermediate or advanced mushroomer, you're going to be paying tons of attention to what trees are around, but it takes time to learn. So you can jump into this process without knowing every tree in your area, but I do recommend that if you really care about mushroom identification, you should learn as many of the trees in your area as possible. They are the way to understand mushroom habitat. Okay, so what makes Central California special, particularly coastal Central California? So I'm assuming most of you are tuning in from somewhere nearby. I hope so, because most of what I talk about tonight is going to be specific or at least focused on Central California. And part of the reason that this is such an amazing area for a lot of reasons, but for fungi particularly, is that there's a really high biodiversity of just organisms in general, not just mushrooms, but plants, insects, excuse me. And that contributes to the diversity of fungi. Some insects disperse fungi, so they bring them here on their bodies. Plants are associated with fungi in very intimate ways. So the more plant diversity you have, generally, you will see more fungi there. We have a lot of live oak forest, an excellent mushroom tree. We have a lot of tan oak forest, an excellent mushroom habitat. We have a lot of coast redwood forest, excellent mushroom habitat. And coast redwoods in particular are not really found elsewhere in the world except for the strip of California that runs from about the Oregon border down to San Luis Obispo. So we're right in the heart of the redwood range. Monterey and Bishop pine. We have beautiful forests of pines that are excellent mushroom hosts. Monterey cypress is actually quite a rare tree in its native range, but it's planted really widely, and they have very special mushrooms that grow with them. So these are some of the examples of what makes our area such a good place to be a mycologist, or a forager, or a mushroomer, however you want to identify yourself. I call myself a mushroomer. Isla is correct. I feel like mycologist refers more to the scientists. I rarely call myself a mycologist. I call myself a naturalist or an ecologist with a special focus on fungi. So here's some of the mushrooms, and here's some of the habitats. That upper row, that blue mushroom, Leptonia carnea, is probably one of my favorite species. It can be found in certain places in our area, not everywhere. It's occasional. It's even somewhat rare, you might say, but it's absolutely gorgeous. One of the most deeply colored mushrooms there is. And you don't find it outside California. You don't find it really outside the range of redwoods. The mushroom in the middle there, the neon yellow-green Cortinarius, that's an oak associate. And it's a mushroom that's pretty uncommon. Most years I see it once or twice, but occasionally it will put on a spectacular show where there'll be hundreds or thousands of them in the woods for a couple weeks during November. The green-looking kind of alien Gumby mushroom at the upper right is called an earth tongue, and it loves growing in the tan oak and redwood forest. That sort of sunlit patch of redwoods on the lower left is an example of the old-growth redwoods at Big Basin, or at least what's left of them. And at the lower right, you see this old-growth oak habitat with no understory plants, beautiful open duff. That's where you want to go if you want to hunt mushrooms in oak forest. Now, one thing I want to say before we launch into the show and tell about edible mushrooms is explain the concept of mycorrhiza. Mycorrhiza comes from two Latin words meaning fungus and root. Myco is fungus, rhizo is root. And the way this works is basically that the underground part of a mushroom, which is, remember, called the mycelium, wraps itself around the root tips of a tree. And the mushroom absorbs water in its mycelium, and it absorbs nutrients and minerals, and it sends them to the tree at those root tips that it's wrapped around. And the tree sends back sugar in return, because a tree can do a magic trick that a mushroom can't, which is to make sugar out of carbon dioxide and water. And it sends those sugars from the leaves down the trunk into the roots and exchanges them for the water, nutrients, and minerals that the fungus is gathering with its mycelium. It's a mutually beneficial symbiosis, and it explains why some mushrooms are only found in some tree habitats, because they actually evolve more and more intimate relationships so they can't grow with other trees over time. Now, some mushrooms are generalists, and you find them in any kind of forest you want to go to, but other mushrooms are hyper specialist, and they only associate with a couple species of trees. So with that, let's get into it. The wild edible mushrooms of Central California. Golden oak chanterelles, this is our state mushroom now, one of the most famous of all mushrooms. It is easily recognized because it's got beautiful colors, these veins on the underside of the cap, white flesh, and kind of a trumpet shape. This is probably one of the easiest mushrooms for beginners to identify. They're often really abundant, so I strongly recommend learning this mushroom if you're interested in foraging wild edibles. They grow all through the winter in live oak habitats. This is my friend Michelle with a nice harvest. They're the largest species of chanterelle in the world. They're not necessarily the most flavorful. There are some really good species that are not this species, but this one is good. I've had it many times. The ones up in Cascadia are much more slender and small, but they're pretty fragrant. So a lot of people like them for that reason. Once again, this is the kind of habitat you want to look for if you're looking for California golden oak chanterelles. Old oaks with open understory. Unfortunately, they sometimes like poison oak. If you get into the poison oak, oftentimes there's chanterelles there, but you may come home with more than you bargained for. The main thing to worry about if you're picking chanterelles is this mushroom right here, the Western jack-o'-lantern. It's beautiful. It glows in the dark. You can dye wool with it. You can dye wool purple, but it's toxic. You can tell it apart because it's more orange to olive colored rather than that golden yellow. It has thin blade-like gills rather than the blunt veins that chanterelles have. It grows directly on wood in clusters. Chanterelles tend to grow singly, and they grow on the ground in soil, not on wood. And jack-o'-lanterns have gray flesh, whereas chanterelles have white flesh. So it's actually pretty easy to tell these two mushrooms apart if you've memorized the differences. And if you've seen them next to each other, you know they're not that similar. But people used to poison themselves by eating this mushroom. It's not so common anymore for people to experience that because we have color photos in all our field guides now. So it's one to be aware of, but not to be afraid of. Okay, the close cousin, well, relatively close, not that close, but certainly in the same family, are black trumpets. Another one that I absolutely recommend to all beginning mushroomers in California. They're really easy to identify. They're really hard to see, though. They're basically just holes in the ground. They're really dark, not easy to spot against the forest litter. But they're flavorful. They dry really easily, so you can store them for later. They rehydrate really easily, and they've got this beautiful, strong flavor that goes well in a variety of dishes. This is what they look like. They make beautiful little bouquets, and you'll notice that they don't have any gills at all. They're just smooth tubes. They like tan oak habitats, they like live oak habitats, and they will often fruit well into the spring. So I took this seasonality chart from iNaturalist, which I'll talk about briefly later, but you can see that people find them a lot in January, February, March, even April. They start about Christmas time. So they're a good winter and spring mushroom to look for. They don't really grow very far south of us. So if you're in Santa Cruz, where I am, there's lots of black trumpets here, but if you want to get into them, you can go north along the coast. This is another mushroom you absolutely need to know. This is not an edible mushroom. This is called the death cap. And the reason you have to know it is because you have to know what not to eat. Keep yourself safe by learning the death cap. It's got a greenish cap that is usually bald, smooth. It's got a ring or a skirt on the stem, and it's got a sac that surrounds the base of the stem. Those are not the only identification features you need to know. You should consult a field guide to learn all the features. But this is a mushroom that is actually extremely common in the winter. You will find thousands of these under the right habitat in December. Live oaks are their favorite locally, but they can grow with just about any tree. They're a true generalist. There was recently a poisoning in Salinas. 3 people were poisoned. And that is a matter of not being able to identify the mushrooms yourself. They were purchased from someone and they just placed their trust in the mushroom seller. It's very rare for that to happen. Almost all mushroom sellers know what they're doing, but apparently there are still some out there that are totally inexperienced. And that's stresses the importance of you being able to verify for yourself that the mushroom you're buying is what you think it is. You would never go to, the grocery store and just ask for carrots, and if you got something totally different in your bag, you would take it home anyways. people want to be able to recognize the produce they're getting. Okay, it is all throughout the state now. It's actually an invasive species imported from Europe, and it has now jumped onto our native host and is spreading really quickly throughout the state. So it's unfortunately an example of an invasive species that also results in human deaths. It's a very bad invasive species. Okay, this is the only one you truly need to be scared of, I would say, although scared is the wrong word, aware of and vigilant about. There are very few other mushrooms in our area that even approach how dangerous this mushroom is. This is a really famous mushroom, Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric. And it's super easy to recognize, often very abundant in pine and oak forests. And it's got an interesting story because people often know it as a poisonous mushroom, but it turns out there is a tradition of eating this mushroom in many places around the world. The way you make it safe is to boil it in 2 changes of water, throw away the water. So you boil it for 7 minutes twice, and that detoxifies it. And sometimes people think, oh, 7 minutes twice, that's so much effort. But that's way less effort than you invest in cooking turkey or chicken or fish. Food processing is part of how we make food edible. And I've eaten this mushroom many times. I don't recommend doing it if you are not comfortable. But if you do feel that you understand how this process works by leaching out water-soluble toxins and then throwing away the water, you end up with a really good edible mushroom that's also really easy to identify. So it is poisonous if it's raw. It is poisonous if you don't process it, but it's really easy to detoxify using the water solubility as a tool. I'm going to show you a little video of one of my favorite mushrooms to pick in the fall. This video shows just how hidden a mushroom can be if it's fruiting early in the season when it's still warm and dry out. So I just see a little bump in the dirt, and I carefully move away the duff, and I reach down gently and uproot what turns out to be quite a large mushroom. This is the cocora, Amanita calyptroderma. It's an absolute iconic species of the fall season. And many people really like this mushroom for its flavor, and other people hate it for the exact same reason. It's kind of strong. People describe it as fishy. Some people think it's a little metallic, but it's really beautiful. This is what it looks like. It's got a cottony patch on a coppery brown cap. And you really should not eat this mushroom if you are not 100% able to identify Amanita phalloides, the death cap. These are the 2 most commonly confused species for one another that actually cause serious poisonings. Like I said, this is a fall species, so it starts to fruit in October and November. By the time January comes around, it peters out and goes away. It is mostly Central California northwards. You don't find it in Southern California. And for those of you saying it looks moldy, that is actually answered by someone else who said there's 2 different veils. There's a veil on the top, that's the universal veil, and a veil on the part of the stem that is right in the middle, that's the partial veil. So it's not moldy at all. Those are perfectly fresh. They just have a covering that stays on the cap like an eggshell. Another Amanita that I want to make you aware of is the springtime Amanita. It looks really similar to the last one, except it doesn't have a skirt or a ring on the stem. It's got a pinkish cap instead of a coppery cap, and instead of fruiting in the fall, it fruits in the spring. So rather than fruiting November, December, October, it fruits February, March, April, and May. It's a springtime species that grows with live oak, and it's absolutely one of the best tasting mushrooms in the world. It is so delicious, one of my favorites, but it is not a beginner's mushroom. It is not something that you should focus on as a beginner because of this species, which it grows right next to, a close relative of the death cap, and it can resemble the mushroom I just showed you because it turns a little bit pinkish if it's exposed to sunlight. And they grow right next to each other, as I said, so they can be very confusing if you're not absolutely 100% sure of what you're doing. The reason that I'm dealing with these Amanitas is not because you should focus on eating Amanitas as a beginner, but you need to know about Amanita ocreata, the destroying angel, and Amanita phalloides, the death cap, because they are the 2 most toxic mushrooms in California. These are the two that you need to focus on and keep yourself safe by being vigilant for them. Once you're familiar with those and you can stay away from them, you can focus on all the rest of the ones that I'm about to teach you that are much safer, much easier to recognize. Okay, so this is once again a springtime mushroom, just like the springtime amanita. Okay, and that one's more widespread throughout the state. I do want to talk now about some good choices for beginners. Some of the boletes are great mushrooms for beginners to focus on, including this one right here, the king bolete. It's a huge mushroom. You can find individual specimens that weigh 5 pounds. I've heard of a single specimen weighing 14 pounds. We have a special version of it. I wanted to point out that there's this feature called reticulation that helps you identify king boletes. If you look at the upper part of the stem, they have a fine fishnet pattern. This fine sort of, what it's called reticulation, which just means a netting. All the king boletes have this. So our particular version that we have here in California actually has a much redder cap. It's really beautiful. It's like a mahogany brown color. And these fruit in huge abundance under pine trees in the fall. Right around Thanksgiving is usually when we get our first flushes. And they're delicious. They're one of the absolute best mushrooms in the world. Here's my friend Carl with a huge bounty of king boletes that he found under Monterey pines one November when we were having a really good season. And this just feels like Thanksgiving to me. It feels like autumn. I love looking for this mushroom. It makes you feel like you found a loaf of bread or something when you find a really big cap. There's a close relative called the queen bolete. Very subtle differences that I'm not going to focus on, but you can look for these in slightly different habitat. In oaks and tan oaks, not so much in pines, depending on where you are. And there's another one called the white king or Barrow's bolete, which is very similar in flavor. It's actually even better in my opinion, but it's not as easy to find in our area. More hardwood oak habitats. And you can even find this one in Arizona. Now here's a mushroom that looks similar to those king boletes, but it's got yellow pores, that yellow sponge layer on the underside of the cap that stains blue. And a lot of times you'll hear people say that boletes that stain blue should not be eaten. Now, that's not always true. For example, this one is an excellent edible right here, but the reason that people say that is because of this mushroom right here. The Satan's bolete sort of resembles a king bolete, but it's got red pores and it stains blue. And it is super toxic. It's not deadly. It's not going to kill you, but it will make you miserable for a couple days. And I know people who've poisoned themselves with this mushroom, and it was a horrible experience. So if you stay away from red-pored, blue-staining boletes, it's one way of keeping yourself safe until you learn the subtleties that help separate things like the butter bolete from things like the Satan's bolete. Here's another group of mushrooms that I really strongly recommend beginners to focus on because they're easier to identify. They fruit in huge abundance very often, and they're safe. There's not really any close lookalikes in our areas. So oyster mushrooms are these fan-shaped mushrooms with gills that grow directly out of wood in usually large clusters. Sometimes they're a little bit more gray-brown, and you can see these gills running down the stem. The stem usually comes out of the cap from the side, so it's sort of off center. It's not in the middle of the cap. And you can find trees that are absolutely loaded with them. You'll find hundreds or even thousands on fallen oaks, especially, but tan oaks. There's not much of an odor. Someone asked that in the chat. To oyster mushrooms, sometimes they smell faintly licoricey, but really pleasant overall. They're fairly large. They have a white spore print, kind of a rubbery feel. And they're a good one for beginners. Chicken of the woods. This is another good one for beginners because it's got a very striking color. It's a shelf with no stem, no gills, just pores on the underside of the cap. And it grows directly out of wood. In our area, it mostly grows on eucalyptus, but it also grows on conifers. Now, I see some people asking about angel wing mushrooms. Angel wings they don't really grow in Central California, which is why I'm not covering them here. But if you go up north to Southern Oregon or Washington, there's a mushroom called angel wings that actually looks very similar to oyster mushrooms. And to get the subtleties of identification straight on those, I recommend getting a book. Basically, they're a little bit more thin and they don't have much of a stem. So there's structural differences that help you tell apart angel wings. They also grow primarily on conifers rather than hardwoods. In our area, you're not going to find angel wings. So if you're in Central California, you don't have to worry about that. But that shows the importance of learning the mushrooms wherever you go. They're not the same everywhere. So chicken of the woods, this Laetiprus that I have on the screen right now, I want to come back to it because although it's easy to recognize, you need to be sure to cook it thoroughly. It's got some compounds in it that irritate some people if not cooked well. I have eaten them many times, and one time when I didn't cook them all the way thoroughly because I was camping, it actually gave me a stomach upset. So just like any food, you have to cook it. Well, not any food, but you can't just eat it raw and expect not to have a stomach upset. Most wild mushrooms need to be cooked really thoroughly to be safe to eat. You wouldn't eat a whole bag of raw potatoes. You should not do the same with wild fungi. Here's another similar one. It is really recognizable. You can scarcely mistake this for anything else. This is called a cauliflower mushroom. It grows at the base of Monterey pines as well as Douglas fir. It can be massive. You can find these that weigh 20 pounds, 30 pounds, 40 pounds, 60 pounds. They're a little bit difficult to clean because all of those folds and ruffles trap debris, but it is absolutely delicious. One of my favorite mushrooms to eat. And I'm not a huge wild mushroom eater personally, but I will go out of my way to pick this one because I love it. It is so good. It has a smell and flavor unlike any other mushroom. It has a texture unlike any other mushroom. And if you find one, you can make 10, 20 dinners with it because they're so big. It fruits primarily in the winter, starting as early as October and going into February, but mostly it's November and December, I would say. Yes, cauliflower mushrooms are native to California. How do you know if it's cooked thoroughly? Basically, it's a matter of softening it through heating. So if you're parboiling it or heating it for a while until it's browned a little bit, usually that's plenty. But that takes some time to get a sense of as you become more of as you deal with mushrooms in the kitchen. So I can't really walk you through all of that tonight. Okay, so cauliflower mushrooms don't grow too far south of us. Anywhere where there's pines or Douglas firs, you have a chance of seeing it. Okay, lion's mane. This looks vaguely similar, except that instead of ruffles and folds, it has hanging teeth. It's a giant pom-pom. These can weigh 10 or 15 pounds. They grow directly on standing trees or on fallen logs. Sometimes you have to look up, sometimes even with binoculars. Lion's mane mushrooms are really delicious, a little easier to clean than cauliflower mushrooms. Here's another one in the same genus, a little bit different species, but it's another lion's mane, Hericium coralloides. You can find this all over the tan oaks in the upper elevations up in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Delicious edibles and really easy to identify. Hanging mass of white teeth growing directly out of a tree. This one is not one that I recommend for beginners because it's a gilled mushroom with a partial veil, so you could risk confusing it with an amanita, but I just want to mention it because it's so famous. This is a mushroom that has been described as smelling like dirty socks and cinnamon red hots. Now, if that doesn't sound like you'd want to eat it, you haven't engaged this mushroom yet. This is the matsutake, and something about its aroma is bewitching to people. This combination of funk and spiciness makes people obsessed with it. And they go hunting for it and they slice it really thinly and they layer it onto soups, clear broth soups with ginger and scallions and rice. And you can make sort of a ramen that's got this cinnamony aroma. It's super highly prized. Here's what it looks like. It grows with pines and manzanitas and tan oaks. So really different habitats, actually, depending on where you are. It can be under pines on the coast. It can be tan oaks in the mountains, and it can be manzanitas in drier areas. And they grow directly out of the soil, not on wood. This grows primarily in the winter, November, December, January. You're not going to see it too much in the fall unless you're in the Sierra Nevada. And it grows primarily starting here in the Bay Area, northwards, as well as in the mountains, the Sierra. It doesn't really grow in Southern California at all. Okay, the last one I want to mention are candy caps. And I don't recommend these for beginners because they're a little bit difficult to identify. They're not impossible. You can certainly do it safely if you go out with someone who knows what they're doing. But they're kind of milky cap. If you look at the gills in the middle there, there's little droplets of liquid coming out of them. And that's because they exude what's called a latex when their tissue is damaged and broken. And the reason candy caps are called candy caps, the reason they're so famous, is they smell like maple syrup when you dry them. And people make desserts with them. Cookies, cheesecake. I've even heard of people infusing vodka with them to get that mapley aroma. It's really a delicious mushroom and very particular to our area. They grow north of here, but Central California, the coastal Central California, all the way to Mendocino is the best place in the world to find this species. They can grow in enormous abundance in the springtime. In our area, they grow with oak and tan oak. If you go to Mendocino, they grow with pines. If you go even further north, you can find them with Douglas fir. But like I said, our area is really the best place in the world to find candy caps. Anytime I go to Oregon and Washington, my friends will say, bring some candy caps with you because we don't find them up here. But they're a little bit challenging to identify. I will refer you to my the website that we set up for our first book, redwoodcoastmushrooms.org. You can click on the tab called Identification Resources, and there is a PDF that I made called A Primer on the Candy Caps. And you can download this PDF, and it will walk you through step-by-step this species, all of its lookalikes, and there's even a self-quiz at the end that you can take to test your knowledge. No one poisons themselves hunting candy caps because the lookalikes are actually not toxic. They just don't taste as good as the candy cap does. So they don't have that maple aroma. Someone is asking what causes them to smell sweet. That's an excellent question. They actually contain a compound called quabolactone, which is also found in certain kinds of plants that reacts with water in the air to form a compound called sodalone. And that just has a maple syrup aroma. It's a chemical that our olfactory neurons detect as a maple aroma. There are a few that taste like chocolate, but unfortunately none of the ones that smell like chocolate, but none of them taste like chocolate. What areas qualify as the Redwood Coast? That's really the coast of California running from San Luis Obispo all the way to the Oregon border. Okay, the last few things I want to talk about are iNaturalist, which is a database that you can use to explore the maps and the seasonality charts that I've been showing you. And you can use it to find places to go. Although, as Megan mentioned at the beginning of the talk, you do need to be sensitive to the fact that social media and online information sharing has made it higher impact for people to point each other in the right direction for where to find certain mushrooms. So please really be mindful of how you share your location and how you pursue other people's locations when you go looking for edible mushrooms. It's not legal everywhere. It can be difficult to find a legal place to pick mushrooms in Central California, but there are places to do it. The last thing I'll say about that is some people asked about picking versus cutting. That doesn't matter so much. How you treat the ground when you're stepping on it matters a lot more. Picking into a mushroom basket when you can allows spores to be released as you walk through the woods. So not putting them in a plastic bag is helpful. So iNaturalist is a platform that allows you to keep track of your own finds. It's like a visual diary of your own encounters with biodiversity. Not just mushrooms, by the way. You can post plants, insects, birds, whatever you want. But I find it really useful for myself for keeping track of what I've found. And you can also contribute to science if you post your observations there. You don't have to post all of your edible mushrooms. You can post the other mushrooms that you're finding that you might be curious about how to identify them. And I use this project all the time. It recently cleared 1 million observations. So you can make a permanent record of species you're finding that researchers will eventually use to understand things like biogeography, changing seasonality in the face of climate change. I use it sometimes when I'm making conservation recommendations for rare species. So it's a really fun community to be a part of, and you get the added benefit that you keep track of your own finds. Lastly, I want to just sort of summarize by why I think fungi are so interesting. I'm going to walk you through this diagram of the connections between fungi and other organisms in an example forest that you might find in Sierra Nevada. So in the middle there, you see a ponderosa pine tree. And for humans, it's really easy to focus on a forest for its trees because they're big, they're impressive. We know what trees are. We have easy ways of relating to them. And so we go to a forest in Yosemite, say, and we say, wow, look at all the beautiful trees. But if you turn the forest upside down and look below the layer of the soil, that's where most of the biodiversity actually is. All the soil invertebrates, the microbes, the bacteria, the fungi are down below ground, and they support the life of the tree that we see above ground. So for example, if you look at the bottom middle of that image, there's some sort of potato-looking circular fungi called rhizopogon. They're a kind of truffle, and they're symbionts, they're mutualists with that tree. They send nutrients and water to the tree to support its life, and the tree sends sugar to those mushrooms. Those mushrooms, in turn, are one of the main food sources for small mammals like squirrels and voles. So the mammals that disperse seeds like acorns and which feed things like owls are eating truffles as one of their main forms of sustenance. Now, the owls that eat the vole actually also disperse the spores of that truffle in their scat because those spores are able to pass through the digestive system of both the squirrel and the owl and still germinate. So the owl is dispersing the truffle through the forest. If you look at that tree and you notice greenish yellow streaks on its bark, those are lichens. And lichens are actually symbiotic organisms that are part fungus and part algae. And they themselves are a tiny little microcosm, a little microfungus world where other organisms live, like the little tardigrade or the water bear right below it. These are microscopic little critters that crawl around on lichens and mosses, and they eat debris and detritus. They're decomposers. And even they are another habitat because there are parasitic fungi, which are those little pink blobs that you see in the circle right below it. There are parasitic fungi that grow on water bears, that live on lichen, that live on a tree that's supported by fungi underground, that feed squirrels, that feed owls, that disperse the spores of that fungus throughout the forest. I'm only going to mention a few other connections here, but that coral root orchid that you see on the right side of the photo, bright red, that is actually an orchid that steals its nutrients from the fungus right below it, rather than to make its own sugar the way most plants do. So there are parasitic plants that steal their nutrients from fungi. And remember, that fungus is getting its sugar from the ponderosa pine that I started with. So this orchid is actually stealing sugar or siphoning sugar away from that tree using the fungus that connects both of them like a straw. Last but not least, there are ways that different tree species can be connected using or via the same mycelium of an individual fungus. And that has led some people to hypothesize about the possibility of communication between trees, redistribution of resources like water or nutrients. And we have some experimental evidence now that that actually does happen, but we're still learning more about how it really works in forest ecosystems. And I would just encourage everyone, if you've heard things like the mother tree or Suzanne Simard's book or the Wood Wide Web, to maintain a level of healthy skepticism about what we really know and what we're really still learning. We do know that trees form connections underground via fungal mycelium, but we don't know how much it actually allows trees to communicate and exchange resources. We're still very much in the early days of learning about those dynamics. So that's almost all of what I have for you tonight. Some people will have questions that we can address after Megan gets back on, but thank you for having me to the Peninsula Open Space Trust and for everyone who tuned in tonight. Hope to see you at the Fungus Fair this weekend.
Wow, thank you, Christian. Chat, can we just give some love to Christian right now for that amazing talk? I feel like I learned so much. Christian, there was so much information, and good job keeping on time and packing it full. As you can see, lots of the chat is giving you lots of love. And as folks are saying thank you, I was taking notes and looking at the questions folks brought in. Let's start with some of the questions that folks submitted. Y'all, literally, I received like over 1,000 questions, literally. And so we did our best to pare it down. And so I'm going to do my best here to share the top questions, I think. Okay, Christian, number one. What's the best way to store and cook mushrooms, especially chanterelles?
Okay, so someone asked this actually in the chat tonight earlier. Storing mushrooms is best and probably most commonly done by drying them. So if you have a food dehydrator like you dry fruit with, you just slice them into little slices, put them on the dehydrator and turn it on and leave it there for a couple days until they are crispy. And when they're perfectly dry, no more water left, you can put them in jars, twist a lid on it, and they'll be good like that for up to decades. I have mushrooms that I've had for almost 20 years now that seem perfectly good if you dry them all the way thoroughly. That said, chanterelles don't dry well. Chanterelles get really tough. So I don't recommend drying chanterelles. Actually, the best way I know of for preserving chanterelles is to saute them or microwave them to get some of the water out and break down some of the cells, and then pack them super full in a Tupperware and freeze it. So chanterelles are best cooked, pre-cooked, and then frozen. Every other mushroom I basically dry.
Excellent. Thank you. What are the most important well, actually, hold on. Not that question. Can you explain DNA barcoding for mushrooms?
Very quickly. Every organism has DNA. When we talk about getting a DNA barcode for mushrooms, we use a special technique to zoom in on a tiny piece of the overall DNA. And we basically determine the letters that represent the DNA information for that little tiny region of the overall DNA. And we compare it to the similar or the same region of other organisms. And because it's such a powerful tool, we're able to find very small differences between similar looking organisms. And it helps us decide where to draw the boundaries between one species and another. And that's why we call it a barcode. It's not the whole suite of DNA we're looking at. We're just looking at an informative section that helps us get the next clue about where to look.
Awesome. Thank you, Christian. Folks, just a reminder, feel free to start typing in your questions. I saved a few from earlier. I'm going through the ones y'all submitted during registration. I'm loving how interactive the chat is. Y'all told me you wanted the hat back, so here's the hat back. So here we go. Another question. Why does mushrooms sometimes grow in rings, like fairy rings?
Well, if you remember the mycelium that I talked about in the life cycle diagram, sometimes the mycelium grows if it's a very homogeneous habitat, if it's all the same tree in every direction, or if it's all grass lawn, you can imagine that a mycelium grows outward from a single point more or less evenly in every direction. And what shape do you get if you grow evenly in every direction? It's a circle. And the mushrooms tend to fruit right at the edge of that circle. So you show up with this ring right around the edge of that mycelium. So it's a fairy ring.
That's very cool. Follow-up question. Blue Arc asks, can mycelium hibernate?
That's a great question. I wish I could tell you how good that question is. I wish I knew the answer, but I am pretty sure that the answer is yes. We have really good reason to believe that mycelia shut down and grow a protective layer over themselves and basically wait for conditions to improve before they start growing out and foraging for food and water again. If that's what you mean by hibernate, I think the answer is yes.
Excellent. What's the best way to get started to grow my own mushrooms?
I would start with oyster mushrooms, except I would not get golden oyster mushrooms. Please do not buy golden oyster mushrooms. I have recently been trying to encourage people not to buy golden oysters because they're an invasive species that a lot of mushroom farms are still selling. And it's really irresponsible. I wish they would stop. So buy other oyster mushrooms, not the golden oysters. Get the regular white kind, or shiitake is another good species to start with. And you can get kits where they are inoculated on little plugs of wood, little dowels. So they're little cylinders of wood that have the mycelium growing on them. And you just get a fresh log of an oak tree or some other tree that's recently been cut down, and you cut it into sections, make holes in it with a drill, and you just knock these little cylinders into the holes, and then you just leave it alone. And over the course of the year, the mycelium will jump off that dowel and it will grow into the log that you've knocked it into. Usually you need to put 20 or 30 plugs of these dowels into a bigger log. And over time, it will slowly colonize that bigger log. And when the rains come, if that log gets humid and damp, you'll have a flush of mushrooms emerge from it.
Thank you. Okay, so you kind of mentioned invasive species. I think this question relates. Let's say you pick a mushroom and you put it down and try to germinate the spores, is that a good thing you should try to do if it's good habitat for it? Is that good for any native species, invasive species, things like that?
It's really hard to do that on purpose. It is possible to do it. I know people who've done it, but it's not something you should really think about doing unless you've done a lot of research about the species you're working with and you have a really good, clear idea of the reasons why you're doing it. Yeah.
Okay, good to know. What's the biggest mushroom you ever seen?
That's a good question. I don't even know if I know the answer off the top of my head, but I have seen some big mushrooms in my life. Today I was looking at a picture of an old observation of mine from Big Basin of a jack-o'-lantern mushroom, where it was a cluster of caps, but they were literally bigger than my body. There was probably like 20 or 30 caps, but they were bigger. Like I sat next to them and they were taller and wider than I was.
Well, what about photographing mushrooms? Any suggestions?
It's an art, but phones these days take amazing photos. So I basically only use this in the woods these days because I don't like carrying my big camera. That said, if you are a photographer and you want to spend time learning how to photograph mushrooms, there's a bunch of really good talks on YouTube by other people, not me, about mushroom photography. Joe Palante, Alan Rockefeller, Alison Pollock, all have really good videos to look at. Yes, it's fun to do, but it is not my main focus these days. Lighting is sort of the most important. And then having a tripod really helps. Those are the two things to focus on. Getting a long exposure using a tripod and having some external lighting like a flash or a ring light like this one right here.
Excellent. All right, Ian asked, fire in our area really changed what we're seeing when the fruit is coming up. Is mycelium dead or is it just dormant?
Some are dead and some are dormant. So there's no doubt in my mind that the fire in the CZU fire in the Santa Cruz Mountains burned up a lot of duff, and that was the food source and the home and the substrate for a lot of mushroom mycelium. So those probably died. There are others that didn't die immediately, but because of the canopy opening up and more wind and more sunlight and more dehydration, they died in the months after the fire. Others probably just went dormant, and others still probably bloomed in response. So it actually is different between different species. Not everything responds the same to the same disturbance.
Roberta asked, what about turkey tails? Are those pretty safe or do they have lookalikes?
Turkey tails actually have a lot of lookalikes, and they're not even really an edible species. They're a medicinal species. They're really tough, really chewy. You don't eat them for food, but some people do pick them to make tinctures or to make powdered fruit bodies to pack into pills because they are sort of supposed to be immune boosting, immune enhancement, medicinal properties. And they're easy to learn to recognize. They do have lookalikes, but if you know the tricks, they're pretty straightforward and they're really common, really abundant. So you can certainly learn them.
Christian didn't ask, if you could eat just one local mushroom for the rest of your life, what would it be?
That is a hard and cruel question. I would hate to be restricted to a single species for the rest of my life. But the answer might be, oh God, that is so hard. Maybe black trumpets. Maybe black trumpets, just because they remind me so much of home. Maybe candy caps. Maybe cauliflower. I'm really not answering the question very succinctly.
That's okay. Luckily, you don't have to pick. You're not limited just to one. All right, this is a good question. I just lost it. Where'd it go? What determines size difference within a grouping of mushrooms?
Good question that I don't really have a good answer to. Sometimes it is the nutritional mode, so where they're getting their sugar. Imagine if you're tapped into the roots of a tree and that tree is sending you sugar all the time. You have plenty of sugar resources to build your fruit bodies out of. But if you're working really hard to break down dead wood just to get a little bit of sugar out of those cellulose compounds, you probably don't have that much left over to make your fruit bodies. Now, there's tons of exceptions to that generalization I just made. But if you make a plot correlating fruit body size to where you're getting your sugar, it's actually true that mycorrhizal mushrooms, the ones that have associations with trees, are on average bigger because they get sugar more easily. So that's one of the things that accounts for differences in fruit body size.
Mm-hmm. Back to my pre-submitted questions. Why are some years better for mushrooms than others?
Because nature is complicated. Just like the cycles of fire and rain and wildflowers, and some years are good for sardines or some years are good for anchovies. Nature just has cycles. Nature has phenomena that all weave into each other. And what trees do in one year might affect what mushrooms do the next year because the resources that they can give to their symbiotic partners changes. The El Nino is an oscillation. It cycles back and forth on yearly or decadal basis, and El Nino profoundly affects how much water we get over the course of our water year, starting in about October and running until about March. Water is certainly the number one structuring factor for whether or not we have a good mushroom year. If there's not rainfall, there's nothing for mushrooms to inflate their fruit bodies with. That's what they use to grow. So rain is the primary determinant of whether we have a good mushroom year, but explaining what makes a good rain year is a very complicated question.
Interesting. This is an interesting question too. Martha asks, are there any extinct fungi in the fossil record?
Absolutely.
All right.
There's not many because they don't preserve very well. They tend to rot before they fossilize, but we do have a few, including some that are preserved in amber.
Wow. Okay. Let's see here, folks. Any questions? Christian, do you see any questions you're like excited to answer?
So many. I mean, there are so many people asking so many good questions. It's hard to keep up.
I know. Let me see if I can find another good one. Well, here. How do fungi actually decompose organic matter?
That's a great question. The mycelium, that super highly branched network of fibers, is basically a big stomach that exudes enzymes out into the world. It just spits enzymes outside of itself, and those enzymes go to work. These are proteins that break down different kinds of compounds like cellulose or lignin, and the breakdown products get reabsorbed. So they're basically just in the process of eating, pushing enzymes out into the world and reabsorbing as much of it as they can. But those enzymes are the chemistry that's accounting for all that breakdown, that decomposition.
Excellent. All right. Dimitri asks, are store-bought mushrooms like the most common white button mushrooms as nutritious as wild-grown ones? Can you speak to the nutritional value of these, or is it more just like for taste and texture and for fun?
I don't know the nutritional value of store-bought mushrooms off the top of my head, but what I will say is that all fungi are different. So some mushrooms are really high in vitamin B, others are really high in vitamin C, others have a lot of protein. They're just like vegetables. They're not all the same. One thing you should know is that they don't have a lot of calories, and like really no mushroom has a lot of calories. And I sometimes hear people say, I want to learn how to forage wild mushrooms so that if I'm in a survival situation, I can eat them. They will never keep you alive. They don't have enough calories for you to make a living on. They're only ever a treat or flavoring. They're not going to keep you alive in the woods. You should learn how to fish or how to dig for tubers if you want to keep yourself alive in the woods.
Excellent. All right, we're running close up against the clock here. I'm just going to take a few more questions. Why do even expert foragers make the mistake of eating poisonous mushrooms such as Amanita phyloides, like the death cap?
That's a great question, and it's also a trick question. Why do even expert foragers make mistakes like eating the death cap? They don't. If you've eaten a death cap, you are not an expert forager by definition. No one who's an expert would eat a death cap. Being able to recognize death caps is step one. If you haven't mastered that, you have a lot of work to do. There are people who think they are experts that poison themselves by eating things like death caps. And that's the risk. That's the real danger, is thinking you know more than you actually do, and hanging around a mushroom club like the Fungus Federation of Santa Cruz or the Bay Area Mycological Society or the Mycological Society of San Francisco or Sonoma County Mycological Association. These are all Bay Area organizations. That will help you not make that mistake because you can go out with people who really do know what they're doing because they've been doing it for 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 years. So finding a mentor, finding an online community at minimum, that is a way to keep yourself safe. Don't rely just on what you think you know. Go get calibration with other people.
Excellent. All right, my last question. Sorry, chat. I know there's so many questions, and I wish we could answer them all, but there's literally hundreds of you on this call, and we would just keep Christian forever, and he's got a fair to be at tomorrow. So, last question here for you, Christian. What's the most fascinating mushroom in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and why?
I don't know what the absolute most fascinating mushroom in the Santa Cruz Mountains is, but I can give you a real answer because 2 days ago, a former student of mine found a species on campus where I work, where I've spent the past 17 years, that I have never seen before and that I've been wanting to see for like 10 years. And it is a mushroom that grows on the feathers of crows. So it is super rare. It's only been found in California a handful of times, and she found it right next to my office, and I'd never seen it before. So I was super stoked. It's called Onigina corvina, and it decomposes keratin. So it just eats the feathers of the crow.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. And it just sounds like it just was meant for you for that moment. Well, thank you so much again, chat. Can we give more love to Christian? That was amazing. I learned so much. I want to just recap some of the things I learned, but one of the best ways, especially when you're talking about identifying mushrooms with other scientists and other enthusiasts, you want to know how to describe them. That includes color, size, substrate it grows in, the stem, cap, skills, using all these descriptive language to explain what this mushroom is that'll help you identify it. And then you also mentioned the Central California area. I just want to mention that what you mean by that is the Central California coast, which the Bay Area includes. And the Redwood Coast that covers your book. Can you remind me what that range is again?
Yeah, it's a coastal area running from San Luis Obispo to the Oregon border.
Excellent. And then one of the best resources that you recommend is going to iNaturalist for more information, community science forums, and all that stuff. All right, Christian, thank you again. Do you have anything else you want to say to our audience before we say goodbye to you?
People often ask how they can get updates about other classes or talks that I'm giving, or just want to keep up on what I'm seeing. And if you follow me on Instagram at Biodiversifile, I am too disorganized to maintain a website. So Instagram it is. Not my favorite place to be, but it's where I am for now.
No worries. I totally get that. You heard it, folks. Follow Christian on Instagram at Biodiversifile. All right, Christian, let's take a quick picture before we say goodbye to you. Here we go. 3, 2, 1, smile. And all right, everybody say goodbye. Bye, Christian. Thank you so much for being here.
See you later. Thanks for being here tonight, everyone. See you at the fair this weekend.
Bye. But wait, chat, don't go anywhere. We have more announcements and a special surprise since you made it to the very end. Like Christian said, come visit us at the Santa Cruz Fungus Fair happening Friday, tomorrow until Sunday. Tickets are $15 to $10, ranging student or general admission prices. Kids under 12 are free. If tickets are sold out, which they aren't yet, the fair is looking for volunteers. So if you want to get free admission and help make the event awesome, go volunteer. By the way, Post is one of the sponsors of the event. I will be there tabling on Sunday. You'll recognize me with this hat. And my colleague, Alexa, who's the producer, making all the magic happen with the chat and the buttons and the everything, will be there on Saturday. Say hi, Alexa.
Hello. Would love to see you.
Awesome. So come visit our table. We'll give you free swag for stopping by. And then our next event is going to be an evening with Amy Tan, author of the Joy Luck Club, and her new book, The Backyard Bird Chronicles. So if you want to know more about nature and bird watching, check out this new event happening February 25th at Mountain View, in person and live. And as a thank you for being here, here's a special opportunity to go on a free guided morning mushroom walk at San Vicente Redwoods with Post and the president of the Fungus Federation, Philip Carpenter. We only have a limited amount of tickets for this walk, so we've decided to do it as a giveaway using a form. So what you want to do is scan that QR code, type or click in the link on the chat, fill out a simple 3-question survey, your name and your email, and we will notify you if you've been selected to go on this walk. We only have a limited number of slots, but you really have a good chance of going on this walk. And depending on interest, we'll see if we want to do more. But this is the special thank you for all of y'all making it through the very end, and we just want to appreciate your time, and let's go mushroom hunting together. All right, so last but not least, we got a few more slides. Come check out our free events. We always host hikes, walks, in-person events, more online webinars that are interactive and fun. We also do volunteer work days and so much more. So go to openspacetrust.org/events to learn more. If you want to know where to go hiking or you want to go find wildflowers, we also publish a lot of free field guides. So check out openspacetrust.org/field guides to learn more about where to go hiking or where to go bike riding and things like that. So free resources all around. And you want to be notified about certain events, what's going on, cool pictures. We even got pictures of mushrooms this season. Follow us on Instagram at PostLandTrust. We're also on Facebook, so give us a like and follow there. And last but not least, if you like tonight's event, please let us know in that survey. Fill it out. You can scan that QR code with your phone or click in the link in the chat. And it was just been so fun, y'all. Like, once again, my name is Megan Wynn. It's been a pleasure to be your host tonight. Thank you so much for being active in chat. Or catch up with you guys. I'll be there at the Santa Cruz Fungus Fair on Sunday, and I'll see you next time. Fill out that form, that survey. Good night, everybody. Thanks for being here. Fill out that form, and see you at the Fungus Fair. Bye-bye.